Thank you, Krishna and Sahel. And I just wanted to reiterate their thanks to Emma and the team for helping to sort out the logistics and organise all of this, and for the Gates Foundation for hosting it, and particularly for championing it within the organisation. Just one quick note of housekeeping, I guess, before we all get started. You are on video today. And so there is a little photo consent form, so if you are able to sign that, and if anyone's uncomfortable about doing that, it's not going public, it won't be stars of YouTube, but if you let us know, then we can organise around that. But I'm just going to do a very quick, just a really quick thing to set the scene on the purpose of the curve, taking us all back, because of course you're familiar with the initiative at a high level. But just worth, in setting the scene, to remind ourselves of the purpose of this initiative, which Krishna touched on. But the Curve is an initiative sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to bring together a community of practitioners in a shared effort to mainstream and rapid experimentation, ongoing feedback, and continuous improvement in the development sector. And really the key words for us there are shared effort and to mainstream, because this is about creating a forum and not lecturing. So we as a consortium, we as the Curve are not coming with all the answers to this, but there are some really important learnings in this room and perspectives that we help by bringing together are really going to help to fuel the change in the sector that we hope to see. And when we set out in developing the Curve, we kind of wrote down our vision and our ambition for what it could be. And it stems from a mindset that we hope and believe is shared by people in this room and many people in the sector. And I'm just going to read it out for those of you who can't see that, but we should never stop questioning what we know and checking how it's working. We cannot afford to wait a year or 2 years, or in some cases till after the project ends, before we find out whether or not what we've been doing is successful and why. We've got big, audacious goals to achieve, which, if met, will improve the health and well-being of millions. We must find a way of learning and adapting as fast as our frontline workers, who are constantly adapting their techniques based on experience with beneficiaries. It's time our sector more fully embeds the culture of continuous improvement, which has increased performance in other spheres, from sports to technology. And that means adopting more action loops, continuous feedback loops to show us how to get better, which help us keep us inquisitive, which don't let us take anything for granted, and which allow us to listen, analyse and respond more regularly, which help us to iterate and experiment so we can test our hunches and improve our outcomes, and help us identify small tweaks and marginal gains that can add up to huge strides in performance. So please join us to be part of the change. Katie, you can say a word or two about how we get there. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much. So we thought we'd just talk a little bit about how we're hoping to achieve the vision as a group together. And just to say one thing, which is really what's the Curve Initiative, what's the main activities within the Curve Initiative. And there's 2 real work streams. So we're running 5 test cases with some of the partners in this room, and part of that is to help generate the evidence base of strong examples of the use of action loops. But then the other side of it is the community of practice, the first meeting of which is today. And what I want to do is just talk a little bit about how we imagine achieving our vision by working together as a community of practice. So this is what we was initially talking about when we wrote the proposal and had this vision, but we're also really keen to hear from you. What are the ways, as a community of practice sitting here today, can we start to help achieve this vision of mainstreaming more rapid responsive feedback across the sector? So we spoke about a few things. So the first is increasing the evidence base of inspiring examples. And Tom will talk more about this, but the aim is to work with the Springboard website that's already live, and actually to develop a resource hub of inspiring examples that can help other people across the sector, as well as people in this room, be inspired about how to do this and what the value of it is. So one of the things we'll circulate after this workshop will be a sort of case study template. And what we'd really love is organisations to think about their bodies of work, case studies that they might be able to share between now and when this project ends in 2020. So we'd love your help in growing that evidence base and inspiring others. The second thing is creating a toolkit of practical tools. So one of the things we're looking at and we'll be discussing over these 2 days are what are some of the barriers to people adopting responsive feedback loops in their work. And what we're really keen to do is go, okay, what kind of tools does that mean people need really to help them do this within their organisations? And it might be that some of you have these tools already, tools you've been using in your organisations that have worked well, and we'd be really happy to keep them branded with your organisation's name, but put them as part of the toolkit. Equally, as we go through the formative research later and look at barriers, we might identify a gap, a tool that's probably needed or something that people need help with but doesn't exist. So over the course of this project, working together, we want to build this toolkit for us to use within the room but also the wider sector. The other thing we'd love your help on is this idea of making sure we have a great understanding of the barriers as a group. And Sarah, one of our colleagues later, will go through what we learned from formative research about the barriers. And we'd really like to make sure we have your understanding of that, but also using these forums, using these workshops to workshop together, well, how could we overcome these barriers? And what's the different role of different types of organisations in overcoming these barriers? The next one is harnessing our social channels. So once the Resource Hub is live, once we have test cases and case studies to share, we will start to create that into social assets that we will send out to your organisations. And we'd really love your help in promoting some of these test cases and driving people to the Resource Hub to see and be inspired by what's possible on action loops. And finally, we're really interested in thinking about what are the annual events that we could look at across between now and 2020, where actually being able to talk about this with our wider sector will be useful. The Social and Behavioural Change Summit in Bali was a good example, and we're really keen to use the sort of talent in this room to draw together panels. So if there's events coming up, we might say, we'd love if you could join a panel to talk about this. So these are the kind of things we imagine doing together. And then in terms of individual organisations, and M&C Saatchi count ourselves obviously in this as well, how do we raise awareness within our own organisations? So we're really keen to make sure it's not just the people in this room that are learning via engaging with each other. So after the event, by the end of June, we'll send you a sort of short deck, probably 30 minutes most, and we'd love for you to think about ways potentially you could present that on within your organisations. And we're really happy to take a role in that. So if it would be helpful for us to be on the phone, if that's presented, then we're very happy to sort of co-present with you guys. But we're really keen to make sure this is embedded back within our organisations. And then, as I mentioned before, sharing case studies with us that we can use and put on the hub. And again, really happy for that to be branded with individual organisations branding. And as I mentioned, suggesting events or conferences that we could join. And we're really open to this changing, by the way. So if anyone has any great ideas about how, as a community of practice, we could be thinking about raising the profile of action loops within the sector, but also encouraging people to take action, then we're really open to thinking about how we best use our time. And then I think Krishna's summed this up at the beginning, so I'll just go through this very quickly. But as Krishna mentioned, this started as a conversation between the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, some of our TAG members, I think Robert Hornick, Richard Wright were mentioned, M&C Saatchi, Harvard and Maggie. And I think Krishna summed it up really, which is we're looking for this fusion of expertise. And what's lovely about the group we have in this room is everyone's probably going to come at it at slightly different angles, and that's one of the things we really wanted. And it's already been great working with Harvard, Vish and Neil from Damagi and his team. We all come at it at different angles, and it's great because we agree in a lot and have the same views, but sometimes we have different perspective, and we found that that's made it richer, and we're hoping to get more of that from the people in this room. But that's how it started. But in terms of who the curve is now, it's all of us. So we just want to be very clear, this isn't a Harvard initiative, it's not an M&C Saatchi initiative, it's not a Damagi initiative. When we talk about the curve, it's every single organisation in this room. And as Krishna mentioned, we have donor organisations here, we have international implementing organisations, both research organisations and practitioners, we have national organisations. And within this room, we're probably all at different levels. Some of us are doing action loops more than others, And the reason why we wanted that mix again is we didn't want it to be just everyone in the room doing it lots, because we're never really going to learn about some of the barriers that's in the way for other people doing it. So we deliberately wanted that mix across our organisation. We also have a technical advisory group, and we're lucky enough to have some of the people from this advisory group in the room today. So we have Soji, we have Richard Wright, we have Uri, we have Neela, and we have Dr. Robert Hornick. And I think there's a couple of ways we'll be using our tag. So coming to events like this to inspire us and ask challenging questions, but also at points in our test cases when we want an opinion, whether that's about data or behavioural science or organisational change, we've put together this technical advisory group really to help us at key points in the project as a sounding board really for what we're doing.
And so, kind of, as Katie touched on, we want to build on existing momentum. So we know that there's a lot of learning, a lot of thinking, and a lot of language, frankly, that exists around responsive feedback. And as this kind of word cloud suggests, adaptive management, agility, real-time monitoring, all of that kind of language out there. And something we know and that came through really strongly in the formative research that we conducted with many of you in this room and with others too, is that this can take many forms, responsive feedback, and it certainly can take many names. And sometimes that can add to the confusion rather than clear it up, and as to what rapid feedback is and how it should be done. So certainly one of the things we're going to talk about later through the responsive feedback and onwards is some terminology for it. An early preference for us, and we've touched on it a couple of times and mentioned it, is action loops. Not trying to impose anything, and it's certainly there for debate, but from our side, when talking about responsive feedback mechanisms, feedback loops imply listening, whereas action loops imply listening, but also doing something about it rapidly, and that's really critical for us. So it encompasses that full circle of rapid feedback and continuous improvement. And one model for that, one model for action loops that we've found useful is this Forrester model with 4 stages to it, between listening, interpreting, reacting, and monitoring. Again, there'll be many different models out there, but this one we have found useful. And thinking about, therefore, what does good look like within that cycle? And we have one early idea for debate, and I think if there aren't already on tables, there will be later, a sort of self-diagnosis tool at each stage with just a few questions that we can ask ourselves about what good looks like, to gauge our current level of ability and to be able to implement action loops. And we will revisit this model this afternoon as part of the formative research across the four stages.
So I get the fun bit. I get to talk through a few stories and some examples of the successful use of responsive feedback loops. So this is the Ethiopian Ministry of Health, and they wanted to get more women in rural villages to come give birth in a hospital. So they thought about how to do that, and they thought, okay, behavioral economics, let's make it easy. So they were going to send stretchers to the villages to physically pick the women up and bring them to hospital. But when they spoke to women about that idea, they said, well, wait a minute, whenever a stretcher comes to our village and someone leaves on a stretcher, often they don't come back. So stretchers had all the wrong symbolism. So they designed a separate maternal stretcher that looked nothing like a normal stretcher, so they avoided all that negative symbolism. And that's just one of many ways they were able to hone their approach through listening and successfully get women to come give birth in hospital. And in just 5 years, actually, from 2011 to 2016, they increased the percentage of Ethiopian women giving birth in hospital from 20% to 73%. So pretty incredible. And the takeout there is that there is no substitute for getting close to actual behaviors, for getting on the ground, for being out there, for being in the field. I know we have lots of passionate people in this room, people passionate about ethnographic research and really getting out there. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir on this, but there is no substitute for getting close to actual behaviors in order to identify those little subtle ways that you can improve. To identify the stretcher fear, for example, which wouldn't have been identified without getting out there. This is BRAC, and BRAC incredibly reduced childhood deaths from diarrhea in Bangladesh by 80%. And they did that. It took them a decade, long, slow, painful process, lots of failures. In the beginning, less than 10% of women who were taught how to make an oral rehydration therapy for their child retained that information and did it successfully. Over time, that got better and better until close to approaching 100% of women retained it. And BRAC did that through going out and listening to what wasn't working. They learned things like telling a rural woman to take half a liter of water isn't going to mean a lot necessarily, but instead, if you go to her house and take a container and mark in that container that this is half a liter, well, that was effective. And through dozens and dozens of lovely rapid feedback innovations like that, BRAC was able to develop a lovely system of 7 simple steps, easy to learn, easy to remember, that helped women know how to save their child's life if that child had diarrhea. So the point here is that multiple small improvements can add up to big gains. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the theory of marginal gains. 1% gains here and there add up to big gains over time. Right, there we go. This is Virginia Mason Hospital, which is right here in Seattle. And Virginia Mason decided to have their own rapid feedback mechanism. And that mechanism was asking staff, how can we be safer? Because staff are out there, staff know, staff can spot ways that things could be safer. They spoke to a colorblind nurse who said the wristbands on patients are colored. It'd be nice if they had text as well, because I, at one point, nearly confused a peanut allergy colored bracelet from a do not resuscitate colored bracelet. So let's put text on these bracelets to avoid little mistakes like that. That might have saved, who knows, 1 life a year, 1 life a decade, but do that many times and you'll add up to big improvements. So the takeout here is that a sample size of 1 can give useful insight. We'll talk a lot during the summit about standards of evidence, and in a world of randomized controlled trials, how rapid feedback can give evidence that is worthwhile listening to and that meets a basic standard of rigor in order for us to take a message away from it shy of a randomized controlled trial. So this is perhaps one case in which a single piece of anecdotal evidence might be worth listening to, or might be worth giving us, giving an indication of something worth paying attention to. And final example, this is the British cycling team. They went from zeros to heroes in quite short order, again by obsessively looking for obsessively getting feedback and coming up with hypotheses about how things could be better, obsessively looking for little things that they could change, and they found that there were lots of things they could do. They took their own mattresses with them to away events so that they could physically sleep in the same position. Sounds a little bit prima donna-ish, but I'm sure it's important for athletes. They painted the floor white in the bike mechanic shop so that any tiny dust mote or bit of grease would be visible. They had a surgeon come in and teach them how to wash their hands so that they wouldn't get sick. They even stopped shaking hands with people on tour so they were less likely to pick up germs. So it was lots of looking in every corner for things that could be improved. And in the end, all of those little changes, from hand washing to mattress shipping, meant that they went from being nobodies in cycling to winning multiple golds at the Olympics. And speaking of standards of evidence, they never could disentangle or quantify the precise effects of each individual thing that they did. So for example, painting the floors white in the bike shop, they were never able to quantify the specific effect of that, but they knew that all of these things collectively had made a big difference. So a takeout is, it's not always necessary to disentangle the precise effects of different factors. Those are some lovely examples for us to learn from.
I'm not as tall as Sarah, so I need to stand up here. So Vishwanath from Harvard. So the reason I think this is so exciting is we are really bringing together two kinds of science to work on this project, both improvement science, a lot of us are familiar with, which is really busy. We will show that a number of factors within the organizations actually have an influence on what actually happens in terms of collecting those data and feeding those data back very quickly, including if you need an organizational champion, the size of the organization, etc. And of course, with the larger systems, I think recently there has been a movement in the field. For example, and some people talk about collective impact. Really looking at a network of organizations in the collective system, the larger ecosystem that influences what happens within it. So the question for us is, to really look at, we want to promote these action loops or feedback loops and this notion of quick collection of data and feed it back to the frontline workers. We are not immune to these other players in the system, that influence it. So we do want to take a kind of a multi-level framework in doing that. And as we do that, I think Katie alluded to the case studies. This is a very busy slide, but the larger point of this is not about collecting every piece of data on every variable here, but as much as being sensitized and being sensitive to the number of factors that influence this. The reason I think where we often fail in behavioral change interventions is when we don't take into consideration other factors. If you think about it in an RCT, you control at any given time only a small set of factors. The rest of the factors are ignored. Because we can't control them, or we'll say we control for them. But the fact of the matter is that a number of these factors influence at each step, whether it is at exploration stage or at adoption, decision, as well as at implementation. But we are also interested in actually sustaining it. It's just not doing it one time. All of us are familiar with the fact that we get the grant, we work on it for 2 years, 3 years, we make the change. The grant is over, we are going to the next grant. But the question is, how do we sustain these changes? At each stage, different set of factors influence it. And this is where, again, as Sarah was saying earlier, this is where you want to get into the weeds, think of things and say, okay, what exactly do we want to measure at what stage? Some of these things we can measure, some of these things we cannot measure. But we also need that kind of a methodological pluralism, in the sense it's a set of case studies, sort of deep, in-depth interviews, some observations, and maybe some quantitative data. All of these have to be brought together, and that's why I think people have called it improvement science and implementation science coming together using some kind of a learning evaluation framework. The learning evaluation framework is exactly that, where you're iteratively experimenting, you're gathering this data, you're using this data, analyzing them immediately, providing that feedback. And you use both so-called, I hate these terms, qualitative and quantitative. Either you do empirical research or you don't do empirical evaluation. So the so-called qualitative and quantitative data come together in a nice way to bring about that change. I just want to add one more point, which I think we'll talk also about evaluation. Most of these data collection at these variables, we have to be very cognizant of the fact that we have to use these kinds of data collection techniques by involving the players. I don't think it should be a top-down data collection as much as kind of empowering the frontline workers as we collect this data, so that everybody is involved in the part of the process and not some team from outside collecting this data. In which case people look at it as an audit and not as evaluation. And that's where the improvement science comes in.
I'll hold it down when you go away. We'll have no secrets left.
So, yeah, some issues that the summit will start to address. So we hope that it's going to provoke a lot of interesting debate and discussion, and I'm sure that already from things that Vish and Sarah and Katie have been saying, there's lots of thoughts already in everyone's head. So we're hoping it will provoke that discussion, as well as some practical help and inspiration as to how to do this better. So a few of the kind of areas and themes that we're going to touch on in this summit, but also in future summits and in between summits too, is how we identify and overcome barriers to becoming adaptive organisations that readily pivots. I think the formative research that we're going to go into shortly is going to certainly touch on that, and then the working session afterwards, which we also think about how we're starting to enable the climate and structure and incentives for an organisation to achieve continuous improvement. Talking about how to harness data and achieve ongoing feedback and ideas for experimentation, there's some great talks happening tomorrow specifically on that, and also we're going to start talking about some of the test cases that we're doing that are aiming to achieve that. How donors can encourage continuous improvement, again touched on by Krishna and others this morning. Again, a great panel hopefully tomorrow that's going to really get into discussion of that. And how to generate and prioritise ideas for experimentation. As Katie mentioned, we have the beginnings of our toolkit, which is very much open and hoping to sort of add and build to that as it goes on, but to share how we've started to use that in some of the test cases that we've started this year. And then in terms of behavioural science and nudges, how they can deliver improvement. So we've got some great expert voices in the room and speakers across the 2 days, so that should be hopefully a really interesting thing to get into. And then one particularly big question, which again has been touched on by Vish, by Sarah, is what constitutes evidence? And I'm sure you're all familiar with various different models or frameworks of standards of evidence. This one is from NESTA, the UK's Innovation Foundation. And the objective in developing these standards of evidence is to help us to know how confident we can be that the evidence provided can show that an intervention is having a positive impact. And I think one really key, important conversation here, which has been reflected in our research, is how do action loops sit alongside and complement traditional forms of M&E and RCTs? Do they have a role, for example, as early signal systems to help spot early signs of success or to flag problems that we might be able to fix before it's too late? There's probably not one answer to that in any given context. But it's nevertheless going to be an important question for us to debate at this summit and in future ones.
Maybe tomorrow there'll be steps over here. So as you can see from the agenda on your tables, we'll take the ideas that are presented here as a jumping off point. And first this morning we'll be thinking about where do we see as the big vision, where do we see the field should be going, how do we see our role in trying to get it there. And then we'll, I think also this morning or early afternoon, be thinking a little bit more realistically about what are some of the barriers and in the current situation, what are some of the gaps, and then think about how we can address those barriers to move the organizations and the field closer to the goal that we have in mind. And then tomorrow we'll really focus on sharing a lot of the tools and strategies that the members of this community of practice have developed and some lessons learned on how to apply them. If I could just add a quick personal note for Dimagi, this is really, it's really thrilling to be here. We've been talking about various ideas over the last few years. We kind of come from the tech sector about like how to make systems more dynamic and do more continuous improvement. And we often feel like we're hitting a brick wall in the conversations we have. And so we kind of started feeling like we were a bit alone. And so it's great to see how wrong we were and how many people are already doing this and how much we can learn from. So it's really great to be here. I think that's the end of the formal presentation. If there's any questions people have now, they could ask a few, and Tom and Katie and Sarah might be